to welcome. It's a great honor for us to welcome Professor Baiba Jaunslaviete as our next keynote speaker. She is professor at Latvian Academy of Music. Her special research subjects are various aspects of Latvian music, its stylistic and historical context. She has given presentations at several international musicological conferences: Riga, Vilnius, Tallinn, Leipzig, Bonn, Lodz, Sofia, Rimini, Zagreb, Tbilisi, etc. And she has published the books and research articles related to various stylistic aspects of 20th and 21st centuries music, the interconnection and interaction of sonoristic and non-sonoristic material in composition, the Oriental elements in Latvian choral music, and the problems of postmodernism. So, dear presenter,
thank you.
Microphone is yours. Yeah. We can start.
Thank you. So. Good afternoon, dear listeners. And first of all, I would like to thank especially Professor Gvanza about the invitation and the opportunity to participate at this Congress. And about my topic. The analytical methodologies could be diversely, and it is always very engaging to get to know new traditions or new approaches in this field. And in my presentation, I would like to provide an analytical insight into two interrelated topics, each of which is interesting also in its own right. The first of them is a dichotomy in music, namely the juxtaposition of two different spheres of expression, either simultaneously in counterpoint or in secession. Both types of dichotomy were already richly represented, especially in the Baroque music. Here I mean, for example, the basso ostinato variations with a rhythmically monotonous bass theme, and the opposite, the other voices with a freedom of rhythm, fantasy-like development, and more subjective, intimate expression. And another dichotomy is prelude and fugue, or there's a section of two dances, a slow, solemn opening dance and the fast, fairy second dance, which we see both in the Pavan-Galliard pair, in the Renaissance and Baroque, and in many of the Hungarian rhapsodies by Franz Liszt. A binary conception born right at the beginning of the Romanticism is a two-movement cycle with a restless first movement, a dramatic first movement, and a quietly resigned meditative second movement. Such an interpretation of the cycle can already be found in the piano sonata number 32 by Beethoven. It is his last piano sonata with its contrast of allegro con brio and adagio molto. However, the most famous example here is the Unfinished Symphony by Franz Schubert. And other possible dichotomies are, for example, Florestan and Eusebius from the Carnival by Schumann, a juxtaposition of a crowd and an individual, as, for example, in the final movement of the Fourth Symphony by Tchaikovsky, and so on. The listing of interesting dichotomies could be continued. In this presentation, I would like to discuss this topic in one specific aspect, namely focusing on stylistic dichotomies that are especially characteristic for the 20th and 21st century, as the age of multiculturalism, when the principle of collage appears in various arts. Are there any main trends, important concepts, composition techniques in the creation of such dichotomies? These are the research questions that I will seek to answer in the presentation. And here you see already on the screen the first type of dichotomy that I would like to discuss. It is based on the paradigm of parallel worlds, which manifests itself in many literary works of science fiction, where the story is developed in different time dimensions, and various cultures that previously seemed almost incompatible are juxtaposed. Their combination creates a surreal effect in the broad sense of this term. The musicologist Valentina Holopova mentions here, for example, the novel The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, in which the story is told in two timelines. The first one being during the Jerusalem of Pontius Pilate, and the second one, the 1930s in the Soviet Union. And the events within these two timelines have no direct interaction whatsoever. They stand on their own and retain their autonomy all the way to the end, even though each reader, of course, based on his or her individual experience, can search mental links between the two. In the creation of this type of dichotomies, all possible musical parameters also could be involved, such as melodics, rhythm, harmony, instrumentation, and so on. However, the role of the harmony should be especially highlighted, because exactly this parameter has experienced the most radical changes during the 20th century, and therefore most vividly reveals the specifics of this age. And it is precisely the contrast of the tonality and atonality that often acquires a special meaning in this context. And as an early musical example of such a conception, the composition Unanswered Question by Charles Ives from 1908 should be mentioned. According to the program published by the composer himself, there are three temporal characters in this work: the string group, the trumpet, and the flutes or other woodwinds. However, I would like to say that the stylistic units are only two, and the first one is represented here by the string cantilene as a symbol of the silence of the Druids, which is related to the stylistics of the tonal music, G major. The flutes that, according to the composer, are a symbol of human beings, and the trumpet with its unanswered question tend towards free atonality, and therefore could be perceived as a musical sign of a different age. Here we see the ending of the composition, but these two lines, they are almost in all the work. We see this sol major in the string group and the cantilene, and this atonal music in woodwind and trumpet part. In the end, these two spheres do not find a common language, and therefore we can say that this unanswered question remains open. Later on, this type of a stylistic dichotomy based on the juxtaposition of tonal and atonal harmony is frequently found in the 20th century music. And I would like to present an interesting example from the music by Arvo Pärt. It is an Estonian composer, and it will be his early work from 1960s. Now the stylistic of Pärt is completely different. He is today recognized as a sacred minimalist, but here we will hear nothing from this minimalism. Also, this work will be sarabande from the collage sur BACH. And let us listen an example. The idea of stylistic dichotomy manifests itself as a succession of two different materials. A little example. So how can I comment it? No, the atonal material encourages a transformation of the tonal theme, and the main aesthetic idea is a contemporary modification of the classic values of the past. And I could say that there is also a certain resemblance with the conception of a famous novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. The same face in different time periods gains surprisingly different traits, and the present that is symbolized by the atonal episodes could be perceived as a parody of the past or of the tonal music. The composition is based on the sarabande from the 6th English suite by Johann Sebastian Bach, and consists of two kinds of sections that I have demonstrated. Firstly, the material from the sarabande by Bach in the instrumentation by Pärt, and it is created in the Baroque style. And secondly, a harmonically altered repetition of the same material as a kind of kingdom of crooked mirrors. Namely, the classical harmonies by Bach are replaced with atonal clusters, and the sounding is strange, unreal. However, Pärt has left the last word or the conclusion of sarabande to Bach, and thus he indirectly reveals his view on the permanent and the changeable in the confrontation of past and present. So, and now we can go to another example, and it will be a fragment from the work Romantic Music by the Latvian composer Pēteris Plakidis. He is first of our composers who made collage an important part of his style. And even the titles of several of his works are notable here. Trios, Romantic Music, Dedication to Haydn, Dedication to Brahms, concertante works, one more Weber opera for clarinet and symphony orchestra, Pasticcio alla Rossini, and so on. I will focus attention on the Romantic Music. This work was created for the classical trio ensemble, violin, cello, and piano. And similarly to the work by Ives, we see a certain personification of the instruments. After a brief introduction, the main stylistic characters or collage objects appear. And the romantic stylistic is represented in the parts of the string instruments, G major tonality. However, the counterpoint of this intimate and sweet cantilene are atonal flex in the piano part, brief motifs or intervals of seconds, and they are harmonically incompatible with the melody. They sound in the high register and in muffled dynamics in a way teasing the romantic cantilene and trying to dismantle it. Both of these stylistic spheres develop in parallel, simultaneously. And we can hear an example from this work. So I will show after introduction. Please. On the one hand, we can perceive these piano motifs as a manifestation of humor with this characteristic feature in the nature and music of Placidus. On the other hand, they also reflect a philosophical dimension, an estrangement of the stylistic of the past, and maybe also former values from the contemporary age. And now I will go to another kind of dichotomy. The contrast between the two sides of this dichotomy is not always as sharp as in the two above-mentioned works, where it was a collage. And another kind that I could demonstrate, it is the well-known violin concerto by Alban Berg, dedicated to the memory of an angel, or the 18-year-old Manon Gropius. It is already from another epoch, the first half of the 20th century. Both movements include, besides other musical material, a quotation from the Carinthian folk song, a muted and dance-like diatonic melody that appears near the end of each movement and contrasts the atonal music of its accompaniment and the whole work. This theme, which quickly fades out, is perceived as a nostalgic symbol of memories of a girl whose life is over. And we also see here a juxtaposition of a tonality. In this fragment, E flat major in the violin part, and atonality. However, the composer has deliberately used muted dynamics, which reduces the dissonant tension, and in the juxtaposition of two stylistic units. And we can hear a little example. So, a moment. Sorry, it was not the beginning, maybe after a minute. So also the dichotomy, but without such sharp contrasts. Along with harmony, another musical parameter that often plays a decisive role in the creating stylistic dichotomies, especially in the second half of the 20th century and in the 21st century, is timbre. It is possible to separate four temporal dichotomies that are frequently found in the contemporary music. Firstly, the ordinary timbres of art music in combination with timbres characteristic of folk music or traditional music. Secondly, the ordinary timbres of art music that could contrast with sonoristically modified timbres. The third case, timbres especially characteristic of a certain style of the past. For example, the harpsichord for the Baroque, and they are juxtaposed with timbres of later origin. And finally, acoustic timbres and electronically generated sounds could reflect the past-present polarity. Now I would like to comment an example for the first kind of the above-mentioned dichotomy, the juxtaposition of ordinary timbres of the art music and timbres of the traditional music. Here I have chosen two works. The first work, it is the symphonic composition or a symphonic vision, Sunset Glow, Vakarblāsma, by Juris Karlsons, a Latvian composer of the older generation, and his work is based on two themes. It begins with muted chords of the post-impressionistic tradition that could yield associations with the sunset glow mentioned in the title. However, Karlsons, both as a personality and as a composer, is inclined more towards dynamic modes of expression, and he had no intention of preserving the mood of silence meditation throughout the whole work. And in the middle section of the composition, the calm post-impressionistic expression is replaced with musical material that, through its rhythmic and harmonic sharpness, reflects the contemporary modern sense of life. Its development culminates into the score number 13. Here we see this culmination, forte fortissimo senza metrum. And after it, one of the final sections of the work from score number 15 could be perceived as a direct opposition to this sharp, dynamic music. It includes a diatonic Latvian folk song performed in a traditional, authentic folk singing style. In the premiere, the song was performed by the folk singer Valentīna Keiša from Latgale. And Latgale, it is a Latvian region whose inhabitants best remember the great role that folk singing once played in everyday life. The fact that Keiša is a member of the older generation, she was born in 1940, this fact is symbolic and highlights an outgoing, fading tradition that we still wish to retain. The musicologist Andris Vecumnieks, who has studied Karlsons' music, mentions other important polarities inherent in this work that complement the temporal and harmonic contrast. I quote, "The orchestra as a mass is confronted with the singers as an individual. The members of the orchestra are dressed in their universal black concert costumes, where the folk narrator dons the unique white folk garb of Aprene country." And Aprene, it should be noted that Aprene after the World War II was annexed from the Soviet Union, and also today it is a part of Russia, but it was a historical Latvian country. An additional confrontation is created by the inactivity of the orchestra members and the mobility of the folk singer. And another kind of temporal opposition is often used by Latvian composers from the middle generation, born after 1970s. These composers also frequently create contrasts between the soundings of classical art music on the one hand and authentic primordial folk singing on the other hand. However, the latter is often represented not by the native Latvian folklore, but rather by a more remote culture. The interpretations of choral soundings are particularly innovative in this sense because they radically change the old Latvian paradigm of choral music as the voice of national ideas. And the historical background to this transformation is described quite effectively in an article by Ilze Šakovska-Liepiņa. You see the fragment of this article. She says about this generation of Latvian composers. They grew up in an independent country after 1990, and they had the opportunity of studying abroad, which in turn fostered new stylistic trends in Latvian music. So, one of the most interesting of the many different manifestations of this interest in other cultures, it is the dichotomy of Western and Eastern cultures. Besides, the Eastern element is presented not only as a part of today's multicultural world, but also as a symbol of ancient culture, a voice of the past that is still clearly heard nowadays, and as a consequence enjoys an even stronger, more stable, and more archetypal expression as the second pole of the dichotomy. An example is a choral composition, Legend of the Walled-In Woman, by the Latvian composer Ēriks Ešervalds. This author often creates a collage of musical and textual material. In this case, too, the text of the composition is bilingual. Folk poetry in Albanian is the dominant element. In the majority of his work, but the lyrics created by the Albanian poet Martin Samai and translated into English are used also, but only in the final section. The work is inspired by the Albanian legend about three brothers who tried to build a castle that would fall apart every night until, following their mother's suggestion, they walled in the youngest brother's wife to prevent the castle from collapsing. Hence, the message of Ešervald's work reflects an idea that in some ways echoes a similar theme in Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Although the conceptual framework for the latter is based on a different mode of musical expression. The music reflects a dialogue between two styles and at the same time two worldviews. And two contrasting vocal techniques are employed. The first is characteristic of Albanian folk song, and its essential feature is an untempered glissando. And the second is a classical choral singing, which includes expressive chords in the style of latter-day Romanticism. And in the next example, we will hear a transition from this vocal style of the Albanian folk song to a classical choral sound. Here is a little example from the first element, but I will show this transition more. the final section of the composition, this second classical singing technique is also represented by a new melody sung in English by two soprano soloists with text by the 20th century poet Martin Samai. And the characteristics of this melody are the intertwining colors of major and minor. This verbal and musical material no longer presents the archaic primordial sense of life, with its trust in destiny and the willingness to offer and sacrifice. On the contrary, the lyrical message behind Samai's poem and music in the style of latter-day Romanticism highlights individual, subjective human feelings, and the attention paid to this aspect is more typical of modern European culture. But as a counterpoint, Albanian folk melody is also repeated, and the tendency towards a quiet and mutual harmony in the conclusion can be interpreted as representing the reflections of the innocent martyr. The contrast between both temporal materials is not very sharp because the composer mostly introduced the new singing technique by gradually layering it against the background of the previous choral song. And we can listen a short excerpt from the final phases of this work. So it is maybe where it is, yeah, here. A short comment about the first example, the previous example, that at the beginning of the piece, the Albanian melody was presented on a scale with flats and the romantic melody on a scale with sharps, but without clearly expressed tonal centers. And at the end of the composition, also the Albanian melody was transposed onto the sharp scale. And here's maybe some influence of the logic of development in the classical sonata form. However, both kinds of musical material never really fuse together. And the performers of the Albanian melody retained the traditional style of singing until the ending, thus diverging from the classical vocal technique of other performers. Another previously mentioned kind of a stylistic dichotomy consists of various oppositions between the standard, it is for me, you can see, it is not for me, no, yeah, sorry. Another kind of a stylistic dichotomy consists of various oppositions between the standard timbres of classical art music and modified sonoristic timbres. An example is the book for cello solo by Pēteris Vasks, dating from 1978. The two movements of the work are titled as fortissimo and pianissimo. Vasks resorts to diverse sonoristically modified percussive soundings in the first movement, fortissimo, with the aim of achieving dramatic tension. The heavy focus on sonorism in his works from this time period may have been due to the influence of Penderecki. Vasks became fascinated with the latter's oeuvre during the listening of Warsaw Autumn Festival recordings. At the time, this festival offered one of the rare opportunities for Soviet Latvian composers to familiarize themselves with Western contemporary music. Meanwhile, in the second movement, pianissimo, the cantilene of the cello is predominant and in some excerpts is enriched by the harmonics or the singing of the cellist. And in this case, the above-mentioned temporal colors could be viewed with a certain nostalgia as signs of the past in opposition to the first movement. So I will show the examples. It is a fragment from the first movement, and here we see the beginning of the second movement. Generally, this work reflects a universal idea close to that represented, for example, in the already mentioned Unfinished Symphony by Schubert. It could be described as a contrast between life's pain, never-ending struggle, and the clarity and harmony of another world. But Vasks had added this sonoristic dimension to this contrast, and maybe little fragments at the ending of the first movement. Yeah, and then sorry. So such different colors of cello. Finally, an interesting example, at least partially related to the main theme of this paper, is the only electronic composition by Sofia Gubaidulina, Vivente, Non-Vivente, or Alive and Dead. for synthesizer from 1970s. The musicologist Valentina Holopova notes that binary oppositions are typical of Gubaidulina, her musical idiom. Alongside vivente, non-vivente, such antitheses we can find, for example, in her works Rumore e Silenzio, Light and Darkness, Garden of the Joy and Sorrow, Even and Odd, Pro e Contra, and so on. And Gubaidulina herself describes the conceptual vision of vivente non-vivente as follows. The storyline is based on the opposition between soundings of natural origin and soundings that are synthesized artificially. Hence, weeping, sighing, crying, laughter, and bells are created from a natural source. However, later they are transformed into artificial soundings. For example, cascades of human laughter suddenly modulate to the terrible mechanical laughter of a machine. Meanwhile, choral singing produced by a machine is sometimes transformed into live human voices. As we see, Gubaidulina's comments, together with the title of the composition itself, accentuates a division not between the past and present, but between dead and alive. Nevertheless, we can interpret this work as an interplay between different times. In any case, the terrible mechanical laughter of a machine mentioned in the quote symbolizes a later period in history compared with the live human voices, and it could be perceived as a warning that the future towards which we are headed will be an animate, mechanized one. Nowadays, both the human world and the world of machines coexist. However, the first has much deeper and stronger roots in the past, and the role of the second will increase in the future. This is further confirmation of how ambivalent the various contexts of the past-present dichotomy can be. Several conclusions. If we compare the dichotomies in the music of the 20th and 21st centuries with those typical of earlier ages, then we can also see a certain continuity. Among the previously discussed, for example, the similarity of the two-movement Bach for cello by Vasks and the conception of the unfinished symphony by Schubert. The dichotomies based on the contrast between European and non-European culture, or the contemporary and ancient sense of the world, also have prototypes in the previous centuries. However, it must be recognized that the use of the sonorism and the performance techniques previously not characteristic for the art music significantly sharpens the contrast between two sides of the dichotomy. Thus, the juxtaposition of different cultures, both geographically and historically distant, are expressed much more strongly than even before. From a conceptual point of view, two interpretations of dichotomies should be distinguished. First, the composer can emphasize the ambiguous coexistence of two stylistic spheres by concluding the composition with a counterpoint, as in the Legend of the Wallet in Woman by Eschenwalds or the Unanswered Question by Ives. And I would like to say that such openness is particularly characteristic for the music of the 20th and 21st century. However, it is also possible to assign a preference, the last word to one of the styles, as we see in the Sarabande from Pēc Kollažas sur PACH. As I have mentioned earlier, this work ends with a quotation from Bach's music, rather than with a sonoristically deformed version of this material. And finally, I would like to express the hope that the ideas manifested in this paper could be further developed in interdisciplinary research aimed at comparing the role of stylistic dichotomies employed in other arts in a similar conceptual context. It will deepen our understanding of the general processes of contemporary culture. Thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you for your brilliant speech and very thought-provoking presentation, and for this brilliant music. Latvian music is something very special. It's merging maybe European, of course, your native and Asian tendencies. So it's brilliant music. Thank you very much. Now we have very good chance to ask some questions, please. Any questions?
If I may.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Professor, for exploring and the very interesting approach that you have given to tell us how these opposites helped shape the sound of, especially of the last 2 centuries. But what was very interesting and what me and my colleagues are curious to know is the connection that you mentioned with Albanian music. That was really interesting to us, since being Albanian too. Could you tell us more about who was the composer and what inspired that piece? You were talking about Albanian legend, which we already know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry if I missed something, but it was Echebalds or any other composer that you mentioned? Because
yeah, it was the work Legend of Wallet in Common by Eriks Eschenwalds.
Yeah.
He is no so maybe choral music composer, and he is performed also abroad, but it was maybe his first such work. It was also won the prize in the Rostrum composition competition.
Yes. We had sorry to interrupt, we had a chance, an opportunity and an honor to have Eschenwalds in Kosovo, in our country. And he had a project with the Kosovo Philharmonic Choir, and we got to know more about his music and inspiration. But I think, if I didn't miss something, it was also Martin Tsamai.
Yes, he has used the text by Martin Tsamai, but his first impression came when he visited in excursion Albania, and then he heard this folk legend, but not the legend, but the song that was based on this legend, this traditional song. And he did not understand these words at this time, but he recorded it, and then it was translated for him. And this sujet was also very inspiring for him.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions? I don't see hands. In this case, I have a question. Do the composers whose music you demonstrated right now comment in one or another way on their views on the dichotomy, explaining why it's important for them? And maybe one short question: how did the audience, music critics, and performers receive the demonstrated works by Latvian composers?
Yeah, thank you. About the first question, the comments of composers about dichotomy. No, I cannot say about all composers, but I can say interesting statements about 2 of them, Plakidis and Vasks. And regarding Pēters Plakidis, Here is one interesting statement, not about the romantic music that we heard, but about his dedication to Brahms. It is also a chamber work, a piano trio, the same performance stuff. And he once admitted to Latvian cellist Ivars Besprasvanovs that he almost does not consider this work as worthy of a serious concert, and said, but it was meant as a joke. However, as performance adds, now we all play these jokes. And the composer was so self-critical, very. But I think that in this romantic music, it is also more than joke. We can see as a joke these two sides of dichotomy, but it is also about the reception of the romantic music in our age, and so different dimensions could be here. And speaking about Pēteris Vasks and his dichotomies, it must first be said that his musical evolution was so that in his youth, the first side of this dichotomy, this sonoristic and atonal music dominated, and the second side, the post-tonal lyrical music, was not very expressed. But in the book of cello, they are both sides. Now, in nowadays, he prefers this second side, this lyrical, meditative music, and he have such quotation, I will quote. In my youth, I wrote in an avant-garde style, but now I understood that in music, the most important thing is love in a broad sense. And how can you tell about the most essential things in harsh avant-garde style? And therefore, I want to write slower and quieter until my music completely fades away, because everything begins from silence, and everything eternal ends. But in between, a story must be told. A story can have drama, even tragedy, but what remains in the end is hope and love. No, it is in his dichotomies, the last word is always this hope and love, we can say. So about. And about the second question about the reception of composers, basically almost all these compositions were received with enthusiasm, both by audiences and critics, and only exception was Vask's book for cello, that sparked sharp debates in music criticism. Because in this time, 1970s, Vasks was a pioneer of sonorism in Latvian music, and before him this style was here unknown and not everyone could understand it. And Vasks made great efforts to collaborate with performers, but it did not always succeed in every genre. For example, for book for cello, he has a great cellist, Maija Prēdele, a student of Rostropovich, who premiered this work. But not all critics understood in this time. Now this work is played also by Solga Beta and Davidas Garingas, and so is recognized. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this brilliant speech and for Latvian music. And now we have